Hello and welcome to my review of Game of Thrones Season 8 Episode 4, The Last of the Starks. Received a score of 6.9 on IMDb, quite a low score. And I had to think about how I was going to approach this review, and at the last minute I changed what I was going to do. So I'm very thorough in my reviews, and I try to do a lot of research, find out what the other critics are saying. And so I spent the day, after watching the episode twice, I spent the last 2 days watching the criticisms of other people. And in the last few hours, I decided I was going to take a different tact. Instead of talking about the weaknesses of the episode, the perceived weaknesses from my viewpoint, instead I'm going to do a little bit of a devil's advocate. And I'm going to discuss some of the factors that contribute to affecting the quality of writing on television, on serial television, and maybe by taking that approach, we together, you and I, we can come to a new view on what exactly is happening with Game of Thrones Season 8, why it feels different to many of us and why it doesn't feel satisfying. And I want to mention at the outset that one of my models for criticism is the film reviewer Roger Ebert. And Roger Ebert felt that it wasn't his job to point out what was wrong in a film. It was his job to help the filmmaker make the film they wanted to make. That's why I think it's important that I spend time here really thinking about what can affect the writing on a TV show, and why is it that some series have a really good first season or a really good pilot, but then they lose their footing and can't seem to gain their footing again. So, we are all aware that this series is based on the books by George R.R. Martin. And for those of us who seem to perceive a change in quality in the last 2 seasons, we feel it's because the material of George R. Martin has been exhausted. And now the showrunners, D.B. Weiss and David Benioff. One second while I make sure I'm getting that right. It might be like Dan Benioff and D.B. Weiss. Hold on. David Benioff and D.B. Weiss. And this theory that I was just beginning to mention goes that because the material has been exhausted, David Benioff and D.B. Weiss are taking the scratch notes or whatever information that's been conveyed to them from George R.R. Martin, and they're having to come up with fill it out. They're having to come out with the plot on their own. So that's the reason why some of us have felt that characters have changed, they become out of character, that the plotting that used to be one of the highlights of the series has become one of the weaknesses. And so you can see the difference that the removal of George R.R. Martin from the creative process has created within the show. And that is a theory that I subscribe to. But now let's begin thinking about what could make this more difficult for finishing the story, could make it more difficult for David Benioff and D.B. Weiss than it could be for George R.R. Martin. And I do want to preface this part by talking about how it's been, 10 years? Over 10 years since George R.R. Martin published the last book of the Game of Thrones. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the last one came out before the first season was made. So that's around 10 years. And I'm of the belief he is working hard on the series, and he takes breaks because he has got stuck in the plot. And so if the person who invented this series and who is known and regarded for the quality of his characters and for his plotting gets stuck for 10 years, and he's given basically unlimited time to finish the story, then others who are trying to finish that same story with the same key plot points but with their own voice, have less time to complete it and have less experience than George R. R. Martin. George R. R. Martin had for years done work in Hollywood. For example, he was one of the writers on the TV show Beauty and the Beast, before giving that up to begin working on his own series, Wild Cards. He is the editor and contributor to that series of books, among others. If him, with years of experience, can't finish the story with an unlimited amount of time, then why should we expect that others with less amount of time? And if George R. R. Martin is a master of plotting, then anyone who takes up after him is probably going to be not quite at the same level. Why should we expect them to do as good of a job? And so that's the situation we're in. I wanted to talk about what is the stress? What are the parameters that someone working on a serial television show, and we're going to presume it's quality television, that it's not just broadcast network, but it's one of the premier series on a streaming service or on a paid cable channel. So in other words, the best conditions possible for a writer. What are the circumstances under which they have to produce an hour of television? And last year, when Westworld Season 2 seemed to take such a dip for me in quality, and I was not alone in my perception of that, I went to look at the production time, the length of time that Series 1 and Series 2 were created under. And I discovered that Series 1 of Westworld was given 3 years of production. So we can guess maybe a year and some months in the writing process, and then the rest in the production. And these new series, beginning with Game of Thrones, that have the quality writing of quality television, but the production values of a Hollywood blockbuster. So, and they're told over hours in a season. They're not done in 2 hours, they're done in 10. This is a new kind of animal. And the writers are expected to perform under conditions that writers have never performed under up to now. There have been writers that have cranked things out before in crappy conditions. There have been writers that crafted well-made television. We look at the heyday of quality television in the 1980s, such as Hill Street Blues and St. Elsewhere, but they were not produced under the budget that these current series have, or the special effects, or even the large cast. And as large as those casts could be, such as Hill Street Blues and St. Elsewhere, I think I'm pretty safe in assuming that Game of Thrones has a larger cast. It's a guess on my part, but I'm pretty sure it has a bigger cast. So, if this is the best of all possible worlds for writers, is it the best of all possible worlds for writers? And so I then looked at Season 2 of Westworld, and I discovered that had a 2-year production cycle. And looking at when shooting began and when the first air date was, it was about 1.5 years of production. And so that left about 6 months for writing. And if we look at these scripts, these are hour-long shows. And if most writers go about the same pace that I do, and I've done the little research I've done, I can write about a page an hour. And I've discovered that's kind of average, that many other writers output about that same level, about 1 page an hour. And for every minute of screen time, that's about 1 minute of screenplay, 1 page of a screenplay. Not exactly, but about. So if a writer is given 1 episode to write for, and that's about standard, they do about 1 episode, sometimes 2 in a season. One writer does, sometimes in a team of 2. Then how long would it take them to do 3 drafts? Which should be like the bare minimum. That should be the bare minimum. There should be more, but that should be the bare minimum. If they need to produce, we'll say 60 pages, so maybe a page and a half, or a page and a paragraph per minute of screen time, which will be about more than 60 pages. So let's just say 60 pages for their episode. Then that's 60 hours of output. If they work 10 hours a day for 6 days, and they get 1 day off, then they can do 1 draft in 1 week. that's working 10-hour days. And I can see it. I know they work really long hours when they're in production. So, and I don't mean just the writers, I mean all the people involved in the show, in a show, any show, tend to put in very long hours. So I could see that. 10 hours a day for 6 days, you got your draft. So at the end of 3 weeks, you've got 3 drafts. And that is presuming that the writer he's able to produce the script without any problems. He comes to page 1, at the end of one day, he's got a page. And he doesn't have to tear up a whole draft and start again. So at the end of 3 weeks, we can get the 3 drafts. However, that's not enough. You want to be able to find, if it's quality television, you want to be able to fine tune it. So yeah, if they're doing 10, and let's look at how many episodes they do in one season. 10 episodes is standard. If they have 6 months, if it's 2 years for a bigger production, like these new blockbuster quality serial shows are, the average used to be 1 year, right? One year, one season. But it seems that it's like 2 years now. And they're given 6 months for the writing process, and they're doing 10 episodes. The math does not compute. If it's 1 month per episode and they're doing 10 episodes, it's just not enough time. And that's not even factoring the time the showrunners need to use to complete their draft for where the whole season is going to go. So if we give 2 months to the showrunners to produce that final draft of and map of what each episode is going to do, then you get a bare minimum. Like the writers have no margin for error. They're going to get their 3 drafts in and done. And do you really believe masterpieces are going to be created under bare minimum conditions? Maybe, but a season is a long time, and it's going to be very hard to have each episode be a masterpiece if you're just giving bare minimum amount of time for the production of the script. And the script should be the most important part of these quality television shows, because that's the hallmark. The writing is going to be better, as good as you can see in movies, if not better. We expect that the writing in Game of Thrones, we will see the production value of a near big budget film in the early seasons. Now it is equal to a big budget film, but in the trade-off, we got better writing. If we look at I think it was episode 7, 8 of season 1, where there was the battle of, was it River Run, where Tyrion is sent off by his father Tywin on a pretty much suicide mission. Tywin does not expect Tyrion's going to win, but Tyrion gets captured by the mountain people, so Tyrion has a secret weapon, so he wins that battle, and that battle was never filmed. In the book, George R.R. Martin has no budget, so he's able to write that battle. It's a wonderful, wonderful battle. George R.R. Martin's a great writer, but they didn't have the budget, so they knock him unconscious. But instead of that, they spent their time developing Shay and Tyrion and not Bran. Hold on, cut. And Bronn. And the drinking game that Tyrion did in that scene has been called back twice. Once in this episode, the one that we just saw, The Last of the Starks. So there was it was a great character scene, and a lot of what was established in that scene was important to the character of Tyrion and Shay throughout the end of their relationship. So we're talking up to the end of, so Shay was the end of season 4. So that one scene that was added to the TV show because they could not do the battle was pivotal enough that 2 different elements played throughout the rest of the series. And that's proof that necessity is the mother of invention. That we would like to have the battle. And episode 3 of season 8, the battle for Winterfell, that needed to be shown. As viewers, after 8 seasons of the White Walkers and the Whites being built up, this confrontation between the North and the men and the existential threat that the White Walkers represented and the Night King, we needed to see that happen. You could not have the equivalent of a cut and come back to the end of the battle and we only learned about it through some dialogue after that fact. That was not going to fly. That would have flown. So we needed to see that. But we don't always need those big budget scenes. Sometimes you can spend more time on developing character, but that's more difficult because it requires writing. It's easier to kind of plan out a dragon scene, of a sequence of dragons flying over the north, than it is to think about how are we going to develop this conflict between Jon Snow and Daenerys, and how are we going to show that Daenerys is slowly sliding into to the Targaryen crazy that she's been able to avoid. How do we do that in a way that's going to surprise the viewer but also make sense, instead of just doing it quite quickly through the course of one episode, more or less. The seeds were laid earlier, even in season 7, when she burnt Samuel Tully's Samuel. Sam Tarly. And before I can continue, I have to address the fact that probably my hair is a little different. I imagine the white balance on the wall is just a little different from just seconds before, and that's because I had audio issues, and the last 9 minutes of the video are junk. There was no sound. So this is the next day, and I now have to continue. Try to remember what I talked about yesterday, 24 hours ago. So I do know that I was getting to the overall point that I feel in this current environment where the ambitions for quality television have increased, the budget for the top tier shows now rivals that of feature films, along with production schedule. The third episode was into the long night of this season of Game of Thrones took 59 days to shoot. That's a feature film. That's longer than many feature films. Many feature films will have a 30-40 day shot, but 59 days at night, just insane. That's crazy. You never imagine, I would never have imagined a TV show getting that kind of shooting schedule. So these are strange days. But the one thing that hasn't been addressed is how to maintain the quality of the writing. So I think that, one, they need to give more time for the writing of these shows. I know that's a hard ask, because the production schedule is so much larger than it was for TV before, and it was always really tight before. But the second thing is that TV before was not reliant upon quality scripts. It was reliant upon genre and programming slot and actors, but not upon writing. Writing just had to be good enough to get filmed, good enough to maintain an audience, but not good enough to sell the audience solely on the writing. But that's not what television is today. Television is sold now, and in the past it was free. It was reliant upon advertising revenue. And for people to buy into this premise that they're going to pay for their television, they expect the product to be a lot better than it was in the past. So that it starts with writing. Secondly, the showrunners. This is kind of a new position, the strength of the showrunner within the past 10, 12 years. And we have seen now, because shows are reliant upon continuity, where in the past they were all basically bubble episodes, and then maybe at the end of the season they would change the status quo. So Cheers was good at that. At the end of each season they would introduce some new dynamic between Sam and Diane that would switch things up for the next season, and then throughout that season, that status quo would remain unless there was, mid-season change, or maybe during sweeps month they might change things up just a little bit. But that's not the case now. Each episode builds upon the story that happened in the episode before that. And so that means the power of the showrunner is magnified. And if the showrunner makes a bad plot decision, the whole series feels it. You cannot cover up bad decision in the story arc. You can make good scenes within that, but you still have to make those characters do the stupid things. So that means that there should be more supervision at the level of the showrunner. And it's not like I'm not asking for the showrunners to give up Final Cut. I'm just asking for the showrunners to have extra eyes. Nick Pizzolatto, for the third season of True Detective, brought in David. I had to cut on the last. Yes, yesterday I had to cut here. David. I have to look it up. He had to bring in David Milch. Well, he didn't have to. He decided to get extra eyes on the art for the season and the scripts. And he also had David Milch write one of the episodes in the season. And I think this case, because of the time pressure to get these shows filmed within 2 years, because longer than that, and you begin to put a strain upon the actors who you may have contracted through 5, 6, 7 seasons, but you didn't contract them for 21 years if it takes 3 years between each season. And in the past, the early seasons were done within a year. So it was season 1, 2011, I think, 2012, and season 2 was the next year, season 3 the year after that. It was only beginning with season 6, where they got 2 years, or maybe only season 7. But in any event, that extra year is still not enough time, because the production demands have increased exponentially. And so but in the past, George R. Martin, because he had written the story, he had given them the guidelines, he was in effect the extra eyes. Without the plot from George R. Martin, they were lacking that oversight. And I think that because there's just so much pressure to get these shows done, that the overall plot gets sacrificed in many cases. The showrunners are under too much pressure. They have to deal with production design, casting, direction, and the writing of the series. It's too many hats for them to wear. And so I think there should be kind of an associate showrunner or associate story editor. I've noticed that in some series there are these positions, and maybe, like for example, The Marvelous Miss Maisel has these writers, and maybe they're better filled in some series than in others. And so maybe the issue here is not that there aren't extra eyes to look at the story arc that is created by the showrunners before passing it along to the writers to create those episodes. Maybe there is those extra eyes, but maybe they are just not up to the task. And I think few writers would be. I think it's an extraordinary ask, the trying to complete this series. George R. Martin, the creator, is having problems because the demands of the plot have become so significant that he doesn't want to finish it without sacrificing quality. And unfortunately, we see that many of the contrived plot moments and the out of character scenes that have happened in season 7 and 8 are a result of the complexity of the story being too much for the writers. And I think it's unfortunate. And I think it's not just all my whole spiel is, it's not just a symptom of this series. It's a symptom of the demands of quality television. That this is my call to give more focus to the writing, more to give more time, and I think more salary too. I read in, I think, Hollywood Reporter that the number of positions within the industry for writers has increased, and their demand, the hours that are expected of them has increased, but the salary has not risen commensurate to the demands of their job. And I think I finished it. We are at about 8 minutes. It was about 9 minutes before. So I think I've said what I wanted to say before. Probably not as polished. I had to kind of rehash my points. So in essence, I had to be the scriptwriter for the work I did as the showrunner yesterday. And hopefully I lived up to the genius of the showrunner from yesterday's recording, and I fear I did not. But in any event, that's all for now. I hope you'll join me for my review of episode 5. 2 more to go. I can hardly believe it. It's been such a long time wondering when this would finish, and we're almost there. So I hope you'll join me for that, and in the meantime, take care and be well. Goodbye. Hello, this is Anatole. This is my testing review of Game of Thrones Season 3, Episode 8, Season 8, Episode 4, Season 5, Episode 2. All 3 covered in a multi-dimensional rift caused by the dire wolf ghost being hugged by Jon Snow, which made the universe crack open, and David Weiss and D.B. Benioff